Hello everyone, this is Glenda Winkleman and welcome back to Creative Grandma. It's Stitch of the Week time and I have a beautiful Tunisian double twist stitch here for our Stitch of the Week, and this pattern is number 226. It's a beautiful combination of the Tunisian purl stitch and the Tunisian cross stitch. So if you look at the picture on the video, the first sample I have to show you is one done in Red Heart Super Saver, and it's done in the color number 316 soft white. And I know a lot of people ask me, why do you always use Red Heart Super Saver? Red Heart Super Saver is the most affordable yarn for as many samples that I make up. I usually buy the more affordable yarn because these samples are just made and really not used for anything. So that's why I use Super Saver so much. This is the classic soft white pattern. If you look, you can see the purl stitches, and then you can see the cross stitch almost looked raised up. This is the best sample because you can see the stitches so much better on this solid color white. My second sample is this one, and this is made using a variegated yarn. Now it's a little harder to see the cables. You can see them. It's hard for me to tell because when I'm looking at the video monitor, sometimes it looks different than what you're seeing. Now for this sample, I use this beautiful Red Heart Super Saver. This color comes in the jumbo skein, and it's Icelandic, and it's number 3952. Now this is a beautiful yarn if you want to make a little boy Afghan. That's really pretty. Now I do have to say this is not the softest of yarn, but if the child is a little older, I wouldn't recommend this for a newborn. I think a more older child it would be okay, but it's not, like I said, the softest of yarn. Now my third sample, I have to admit, I started it and I threw it down and I thought, I do not like that. I don't like how this pattern looks when you change colors. And then I thought, what the heck, I'm going to go ahead and work it up and see, once I get a little more done, if I like it. So let me put that down. And this, I'm not sure. Once I started it working it up, it really did create its own uniqueness. It just had a real unique look where the purl stitches intertwine the colors and they're like seem all mixed up, but then the cross stitch are solid as they go up. So just a kind of really unique look. I guess it's just up to the person making it, but this is what I'm saying. When you buy yarn and you're looking at a pattern and you're figuring it out in your head, sometimes what you picture isn't what you get. So I did not think I would get this pattern when I changed colors, so it kind of threw me off a little bit. It created this uniqueness. Now, me personally, I always love the look of the classic white. This, to me, I just love how it just has a beautiful look and texture, and it shows it off more with the solid color. But again, this did create a nice unique pattern, so it's all on what you like. Now this sample was made using the Red Heart Super Saver in color number 316 soft white, and then I used Red Heart Super Saver in the color Grape Fizz number 3931. So that created this pattern, and this pattern I change colors every row. And the nice thing is, if you do like this pattern and you want to change colors every row, when you change your color at the end of the row, you don't have to fasten off. You just carry that other color right up the side of your work, and then you just pick up the new color when you come back. Because this pattern, if you've never done Tunisian crochet, you work the first half of the row over, and then you take all your loops off and come back. So row 2 starts right above the start of row 1. So that's how you can just run your thread up, and it just works nicely up the edge. So that's a nice way of doing it. You just have your two skeins there at the same time and just carry that thread up the back. For these samples, I did use a unique hook size. I used a size L 11 US size, which is an 8mm. That's a little bit larger than the regular Afghan hooks. Now these are really hard to find. I mean, I've been going into the craft stores, I'd say in about 100-mile radius of my house in all directions, trying to find Afghan hooks because I wanted to do a giveaway. And of course, I can't find them anywhere. I mean, the craft stores in my area just are not stocking the longer 14-inch Afghan hooks. So my suggestion to you is, if you want to make this stitch for a scarf, something that's only like 25 stitches wide, you can buy the regular crochet hook. And what I do, and I didn't think of this because it's just come off the top of my head, if you buy a regular size L11 crochet hook, they're about 8 inches long, you can get 20-25 stitches. What I usually do when I run into a problem is I'll take a regular crochet hook, I'll wrap rubber bands around the end, several rubber bands, to create like a end to my hook so those stitches won't come off, and I'll just use a regular hook if it's for something narrow that you can do. So that's just a suggestion if you can find the smaller hook. Now if you want to make an Afghan, then you're probably going to have to get online and buy these hooks. These I purchased from Annie's Attic, and then they discontinued them, and I love these hooks. I just wish I had like 10 of each one. I just love the larger hooks. It creates a beautiful just a nice texture, not a real heavy close, but just a nice feeling texture to your stitches. So now you can use a size 10.5K for your sample. So if you do have the size 10.5K hook, go ahead and use that to make your sample. You can even make this with lightweight yarn and a smaller hook. You do not have to use worsted weight yarn. That is just what I chose for the video. So to make our sample, we're going to need to chain 22. So get your yarn, get your hook, get your chain 22 made, and I'll be right back and show you step by step how to do this beautiful stitch. For my sample, I am using Red Heart Super Saver in the color 774 Light Raspberry. It's a gorgeous medium color pink, just wonderful color. I have my chain 22 ready. So if you've never crocheted before, you just made your chain, and each one of these loops are your chain. We're going to skip this first chain, and you're going to insert your hook into the second chain from hook. This is a very easy row to do. You're going to put your yarn over your hook, and you're going to pull it through that chain. You're going to keep all your loops on your hook as you work across the row. So the one important thing to remember when working the Tunisian stitch is whatever you started with, if you started with a chain 22, you should have 22 loops on your hook. If you start and you want to make an Afghan and you have 150 loops on your hook, when you get to the end of your first half of row 1, when you get clear to the end before you take your loops off, you should have 150 loops on your hook. So whatever your beginning chain is how many loops you should have on your hook. So insert your hook into the next chain, yarn over the hook, and pull it through the chain. And you're going to repeat this across. You're going to go into the next chain, yarn over the hook, and pull it through, keeping all loops on your hook. Insert your hook into the next chain, yarn over the hook, and pull it through that chain. Insert your hook into the next chain, yarn over the hook, and pull it through the chain. I'll show you one more time, and then you can continue across to the last chain. Insert your hook into that next chain, yarn over the hook, and pull it through that chain. You will be keeping all loops on your hook. You will work over to your last chain. You will insert your hook into that last chain, Put your yarn over the hook and pull it through that chain. You should have a total of 22 loops. Finish the first half of row 1 and I will meet you at the end. I'm over at the end of the first half of row 1. I stopped right before the last stitch, so I wanted to actually show you how to do that last stitch. It's the same as the others. You're just going to insert your hook into that last chain, yarn over, and pull it through. So now you should have a total of 22 loops on your hook. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, and 22. So whatever your starting chain is, I did forget to say, this stitch has a multiple of 6 and then add 4. So a multiple of 6 plus 4. So to finish row 1, this is the second half. So you're going to put the yarn over the hook and you're going to pull through 1 loop only. That is your edge stitch. So yarn over the hook and pull through 1 loop creates your edge stitch. Now to finish taking all the loops off the hook, you're going to put the yarn over the hook and now you're going to pull through 2 loops on the hook. And this is taking your stitches back off your hook. Yarn over the hook, pull through 2 loops on the hook. Yarn over the hook and pull through 2 loops. Yarn over the hook and pull through 2 loops. And you're just going to repeat that across, putting the yarn over and pulling through 2 loops. I'm going to go ahead and work right across. I hope I'm not going too fast. Row 1 is the base row, and row 2 will actually turn these stitches. They won't look the same. The base row is just the foundation row. For when you do row 2, it will come down into row 1 and form the stitches. So we worked across, and you take them off until you get to the last 2 loops, yarn over the hook, and you pull through 2 loops. So what this does is you have 1 loop remaining, and this loop counts as the first stitch of the next row. I'm at the end of row 1, and this is what your work should look like. This is just a base row of the regular Tunisian Afghan stitch. That's all that row is. So now we're going to actually start our repeat row, which is our pattern row, and this is a wonderful pattern because it's only a 1 row repeat. So once you learn how to do row 2, you just do that row over and over again. So to start row 2, your last loop of row 1 is your first stitch of row 2. So this stitch will line up with your edging stitch, and you will never work in this stitch for this pattern. This stitch remains unworked. So follow that stitch down, and you will work your first stitch over here in the second stitch. So we're going to do a purl stitch, a cross stitch, and a cross stitch. That's our pattern that we're going to work across our row. So to do the purl stitch, you're going to put your yarn from the front to the back across the top of the hook. You're going to insert it into that next vertical stitch just under the stitch. You're going to take your yarn and you're going to bring it back down from the back to the front, and you're going to put it right at the base of your hook in that stitch, right, well, not in the stitch, but you're just going to bring the yarn down in front of that stitch but at the base of your hook, and you're going to take it from front to the back of your hook. Then you're going to take your yarn and bring it back around to the front of your hook, and you're going to pull it through the stitch. So you just made your first purl stitch. Now you might get a little intimidated by this stitch, but once you do this stitch several times, you'll be whipping right through this. It's just, if you've never done it before, when I first learned, I got a little frustrated with it because I was trying to learn it from a book. And when you're reading all that stuff, it just sometimes just does not make sense. So let me walk you through it step by step. Do not get intimidated. Take your time, and we'll get through it, and you'll love this pattern. You'll love this stitch. and you'll pat yourself on the back because this is a beautiful pattern if you master it, and it is quite easy once you get the hang of doing this purl stitch. Okay, so the next purl stitch, you bring that yarn to the front of your hook and then put it to the back. I'm trying to do this as slow as I can so you can see. So you experienced crocheters, I'm sorry I'm going slow, but a lot of people have never done this stitch before. So you can just go ahead and work ahead if you want. So your yarn is from the front to the back over your hook. You're going to insert it into that next vertical stitch. Then you're going to bring that yarn back down to the front of your hook, right at the base of your hook in front of that stitch, and you're going to take it from front to back behind the hook. Then you're going to take the yarn and you're going to bring it back over from back to front across the top of that hook. Once you do that, you're just going to pull it through one loop only on your hook. You just made your second purl stitch. So now we're going to work 2 cross stitch across the next 4 stitches. Each cross stitch requires 2 vertical stitches. So it'll be a total of 4 stitches we're working in. So you're going to skip this next vertical stitch. You're going to insert your hook into the next vertical stitch just under the stitch. You're going to bring your yarn from the back to the front across your hook, and you're going to pull it through that stitch. Now you're going to work backwards and you're going to go into the stitch that you just skipped. So you're going to pull your hook back, you're going to insert it underneath that previously skipped vertical stitch, yarn from back to front over the hook, and just pull it through 1 stitch only on your hook. You should have a total of 5 loops on your hook at this point. You have your beginning loop, you work 2 purl stitches, and you just worked your first cross stitch, which is 2 loops, so a total of 5. So now we're going to work 1 more cross stitch. You're going to skip this next vertical stitch. You're going to insert your hook under the next vertical stitch, yarn from back to front over the hook, and pull it through that stitch. You're going to work backwards into that previously skipped vertical stitch. So you're going to pull that hook back, you're going to insert it into that previously skipped vertical stitch, yarn from the back to the front across the top of your hook, and pull it through 1 loop only. Now you have 2, 4, 6, 7 loops on your hook, and this creates the repeat across the row. So now we're going to go ahead and repeat the 2 purls and the 2 cross stitches. Like I said, take your time, go slow. Once you do several rows of the stitch, you're just going to love it. I just absolutely love the stitch pattern. Okay, so our first purl, yarn, bring it from the back to the front in front of that hook and across the top of your hook. So your yarn is now going from front to back across the top of the hook. You're going to insert it into that next vertical stitch. You're going to drop that yarn back down in front of your work to the base of your hook, and then from front to back underneath the hook, so the yarn's in the back. Then you're going to bring that yarn back across from back to front across the top of your hook, and you're just going to pull it through 1 loop only on your hook. You just made your first purl stitch of your second repeat. We need 1 more purl stitch. Yarn from the back, bring it underneath the hook, and then from front to back across the top of your hook. Insert your hook into that next vertical stitch. Take your yarn from the back to the front again, right into the front of the work, in front of that stitch you're working on. Drop the yarn underneath your hook and to the back. Bring the yarn from the back to the front across the top of your hook, and pull it through 1 loop only on your hook. You just made your second purl stitch. Now we need to work 2 cross stitches. You're going to skip the next vertical stitch, insert your hook into the next vertical stitch, yarn from back to front across the top of your hook, and pull it through 1 loop only. You're going to work backwards into the previously skipped stitch. So you're going to pull that hook back. You're going to insert it underneath that vertical stitch that you skipped, yarn from the back to the front across the top of your hook, and pull it through 1 loop only. So you just made your first crossed stitch. Now we need to make 1 more. So you're going to skip this next vertical stitch. You're going to insert your hook into that next stitch, yarn from back to front over the hook, and pull it through that stitch. You're going to come back and work in your previously skipped stitch. So pull that hook back, insert it into that previously skipped stitch, yarn from back to front across the top of the hook, and pull it through 1 loop only. So now we have our beginning loop, our 2 purl. You have a cross stitch, a cross stitch. You have 2 purl, a cross stitch, and a cross stitch. So you just repeated the repeat 2 times. So I'm going to go ahead and work this row completely across with you, because if you kind of have the basics, but this is just a little scary with the flipping of the front to back, top and under, we'll get through it. So let's do it again. Okay, you need to make 2 purl stitches. So you're going to take your yarn and you're going to bring it from the back to front and across the top of your hook from front to back. It's just draping from front to back across that hook. You're going to insert your hook into that next vertical stitch. You're going to take your yarn, you're going to bring it back to the front of the work, and you're going to bring it to the base of your hook, to the base of your crochet hook in front of the stitch you're working on, and you're going to take the yarn underneath your hook from front to back. You're going to take your yarn and you're going to bring it from the back to the front across the top of your hook, and make sure your tension is nice and, you know, just a nice even tension, and then pull it through 1 loop only. So that was the first purl stitch of your 3rd repeat. We need to make another purl stitch. Bring your yarn from the front to the back across the top of your hook. Insert your hook into that next vertical stitch. Drop that yarn back to the front of your work underneath your hook and in front of the stitch you're working on. Take your yarn from the front to the back underneath the hook, so the yarn's in back of the hook. Then bring your yarn from the back to the front across the top of the hook. Make sure your tension is nice and even, and pull through 1 loop only. You just worked your 2nd purl stitch of your 3rd repeat. So now we're going to work 2 cross stitches. So you're going to skip the next vertical stitch, insert into the next. Yarn from the back to the front and pull through that stitch. You're going to work in the previously skipped stitch, so pull that hook back, insert it underneath that previously skipped vertical stitch, yarn from back to front, and pull it through 1 loop only. And you just made your first cross stitch of the 3rd repeat. So you're going to make 1 more cross stitch. You're going to skip the next vertical stitch, and you're going to insert your hook into the next vertical stitch. Yarn from the back to the front and pull through that stitch. You're going to work in the previously skipped vertical stitch, so pull that hook back, insert it into that previously skipped vertical stitch, yarn from the back to the front, and pull through 1 loop. So we just did the first or the last 2 cross stitch of that repeat. So to end the row, we end with a purl stitch, regular Afghan stitch. So let's finish our sample. We're going to do 2 more purl stitches. So yarn from back to front, and you're going to take it from front to back across the top of that hook. You're going to insert your hook into that next vertical stitch. You're going to take your yarn and you're going to drop it back down to the front of your work, to the base of your hook, and in front of the stitch you're working on. So if you look, your stitch is here, your yarn is in front of it, and then you're going to take your yarn underneath your hook from front to back. So your yarn is now in the back of your hook, and you're going to bring the yarn from back to front across the top of your hook. And you're going to pull through 1 loop only. We're going to work our last purl stitch across. So bring that yarn to the front of your hook and across the top to the back. Insert your hook into the next vertical stitch. Drop that yarn back down to the front of your work, to the base of the hook, underneath the hook from front to back. You're going to bring your yarn from the back to front over the top of that hook. Make sure your tension is nice and even, not too loose, not too tight, and pull through 1 loop on the hook. So we just done row 2 and we're over to our last vertical stitch. Now sometimes when you're working the Afghan stitch, there's 2 ways to end a row. For this particular pattern, you have to go in just 1 loop only, and that's the top vertical stitch. You're just going to go through that one. Now some patterns will tell you to go through both loops. If you do that, then your work is going to slant, because what happens is when you're doing, when you go through both loops, what happens is it eventually, when you get so many rows up, it's shorter, just a hair shorter, but your work, there, I have a hair or a thread there that's annoying me. Okay. So when you do that, it'll get real tight on this side, and then your right side will be higher, and it'll start deforming your work. So for this particular pattern, when you get to this end stitch, only go under 1, just the one strand, or you're going to have trouble with your sides of your work. So just go under the 1 strand, yarn over the hook from back to front, and pull through that loop. So now if you count your loops, you should have 22, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, and 22. You always have the same amount of loops on your hook when you get to the end of that row that you had in your starting chain. So to take off row 2 is basically the same as taking it off for row 1. This is how you'll take it off for all remaining rows. It's the same for the second half. You put the yarn over the hook from back to front and pull through 1 loop only. So for your edging stitch, you only go through 1 loop. So to take the rest of the loops off your hook, you're going to put the yarn over your hook from back to front and pull through 2 loops. Yarn from back to front over your hook and pull through 2 loops. Yarn over the hook and pull through 2 loops. Yarn over the hook and pull through 2 loops. And you just continue that across. Let me go ahead and work across with you. If I'm going too fast, just pause the video and you can meet me at the end. So we're almost to the end. And when you get clear to the end, okay, you have 2 loops on your hook. You're going to yarn over and pull through both loops, and you end up with 1 loop at the end of each row. And when you get to the end of each row, that loop will be your first stitch of the next row, and it should line up with this. And for this pattern, you never work in this stitch. You're always going over here to the second stitch. So row 2 is your repeat row, and if you look If you look, you can see that now your vertical bars are up here. These are the stitches you're going to work in. So because I went really slow in row 2, I'm not going to explain exactly how to do the stitch. I'm just going to go ahead and work one more row and show you. So if I go too fast, just go back on the video to where I started row 2, and you can just repeat that until you get the hang of this stitch. So I'm going to do the first half of the row just to show you again how this pattern works. You're going to do a purl stitch, you're going to do a purl stitch, you're going to do a cross stitch over the next 2 stitches. It takes 2 stitches to make a cross stitch. We're going to make another cross stitch. So basically what you're doing is the purl stitches are worked on top of each purl stitch, and the cross stitches, your purl stitches on top of the purl stitch on top, cross stitch on top of a cross stitch on top of a cross stitch. That's what makes the pattern. You're going to work a purl stitch into the next stitch, a purl stitch into the next stitch, a cross stitch into the next stitch, a cross stitch into the next stitch, and like I said, what I'm doing is exactly what I showed you detail for detail in row 2. Okay, so now we need the purl stitch in the next stitch, a purl stitch into the next stitch, a cross stitch. You'll be working into the next 2 stitches, so you skip that first stitch and then you work your cross stitch and come back into that skip stitch. You're going to work another cross stitch, we're over to our last 3 vertical stitches, and you end with 2 purl stitches and a regular Afghan stitch. So we need to make our purl stitch into the next stitch, a purl stitch into the next stitch, and you're going to work in this top stitch only. Insert into that last vertical stitch, yarn over the hook and pull it through. So there we worked row 3, which is exactly the same as row 2. Row 2 is your repeat pattern. Now I am going to take this row off very quickly because I had a subscriber say, can you show me how you hold your yarn for tension? Now everybody, depending on who taught you and how you were taught, a lot of people hold their yarn differently. Now I hold my yarn a little differently than everybody else, but this is how I was taught, so this is how I do it. If you're new to crocheting, it's kind of weird if you don't know how to hold your yarn. I'm not sure if basically my yarn goes over my middle finger and down between my middle finger, and this is kind of like my tension, like on a sewing machine where your thread goes through that tension, and you just kind of regulate it. You don't let it get real loose, you don't let it get real, you don't want to pull it real tight, you don't want it hanging like this. You just keep it like a nice consistent, just nice consistent, not real tight and not real loose. I don't think I'm real good at explaining this, but this is how I hold my yarn. And like I said, I've watched a lot of videos of other crocheters, and I've noticed there's a lot of different ways to hold your yarn. You just have to figure out what is most comfortable for you. Okay, let's take our loops off. You're going to put the yarn over your hook. and pull through one loop only for that edge stitch. Yarn over the hook and pull it through 2 loops. Yarn over the hook and pull it through 2 loops. Yarn over the hook and pull it through 2 loops. You're going to keep working that across until you have 1 loop remaining on your hook, which counts as the first loop of the next row. So let me go ahead and finish this off. And if you're trying to learn the stitch just using at least a size J or K, preferably a K, this size 11 hook is big, and like I said, I do that so I can really show the detail of the stitches. But when you're learning, the larger hooks kind of help so you can see your stitches better. Once you master it with the larger hook and you got your sample to where you like it, then drop down to the required hook size for the yarn you want to use. But to learn this stitch, I would really recommend using the largest hook you have. I mean, you know, not like a Q, but like this is an L or a K would be preferable, just so you get the gist of the stitch and how loose it is, and you can find them better. The smaller the hook, the tighter the stitches, the smaller the stitches. So to learn this, use a bigger hook. Okay, so that's our stitch. Doesn't quite look the same when you're only on your first couple rows, but you can see how your pattern is forming. Here are your purl stitches and here is your cross stitch. So we just got done working row 3, which is exactly the same as row 2. So I do want to show you how to finish off your work. If you get this piece to whatever size you want, or if you're making an afghan, a scarf, whatever, when you get to the point where you say, okay, this is finished, your last row will look like this, where all your stitches will be going straight up and down. So we want those stitches to match your pattern. So what we're going to do is, you already know at this point how to do the purl stitch and the cross stitch. So what you're going to do is you're going to work your stitch, but instead of going through and to the point where you're going through that stitch and going through that 1 loop, you're just going to put your stitches through all loops on the hook. So I'm going to go ahead and start making my purl stitch. So now I'm at the point where you would usually just go through this first stitch, and then you made your purl stitch. So when you get to the last portion of your stitch where you're ready to go through your stitch, you're just going to go through all loops on hook. And then this stitch here is your first stitch across. It's going to pull down a little bit, but eventually it'll go over, and that's your first stitch when you do your border. So I'm going to go ahead and get ready, and I'm doing my next purl stitch. And I'm just getting ready to pull through that loop on my hook. So instead of just pulling through the stitch, you pull through all loops on your hook. And this is binding off your work. So now you have a cross stitch, so you're just going to work it like you're doing a regular cross stitch. You're getting ready to pull your yarn through the stitch, so instead of pulling that and keeping your loop on the hook, you're pulling through all loops on hook. You're going to come back into the front of that cross stitch just like you're making the stitch. You're going to pull through that stitch, but you're going to pull through all loops on your hook. And you're just, whoops, what did I do there? I split my yarn. Get that. Okay. Now we have another cross stitch to do. So you skip your first half of that cross stitch. You're going to work it. Instead of pulling through the stitch, you pull through all loops on the hook. You come back, you go into the first part of that cross stitch. Yarn over the hook. Instead of pulling through just that 1 loop, you pull through all loops. And that is how you bind off your work. So you continue doing it in that manner across. You go into your purl stitches and your cross stitch, work them just like you're working the stitch, but go through all loops on the hook instead of the just 1. And I'll meet you at the end of the row to show you how to finish your work. Okay, I'm binding off my work, and you will have little I guess humps, little rises here. Let me just, this pink yarn's a little bit thicker than the other yarn, so it shows up a little more. But on this white sample, you can see how it does raise up. You can correct this when you do your border. You can even that out by whatever border you choose on there. So I'm over at the last vertical stitch of my work when I'm binding off. So you're going to do the same thing. You're just going to go under this one strand of yarn here, the last vertical stitch under one strand, yarn over the hook, and pull it through all loops on the hook. And then you're just going to fasten off your work, weave in your ends, and that is how you bind off your work. So let me show you my samples again. This is the one where I changed colors. I started with white and I changed colors every other row. This is the sample made using the variegated yarn. It's a little harder to see the pattern, but you can see it raised up a little bit here. This one, it doesn't show up so much in here. And then of course the white where you can really see the stitches. And again, I just think this is a beautiful stitch, wonderful for baby Afghans, any Afghans. It's just a wonderful stitch. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Stitch of the Week of the Tunisian double twist stitch pattern. So please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. And thank you for stopping by. Happy crocheting, everyone.